Well, we are in our series of Ruth, and so if you want to take your Bibles out and turn to chapter 23, that would be awesome. And there's one of the things that we're going to go over today that we need to talk about first. Some of you are realizing and recognizing that Ruth only has 4 chapters right now. So turning to chapter 23 is what's happening. We're going to be in Leviticus. We're going to be starting in Leviticus chapter 23 as we go through this next message in our series as we dive into the book of Ruth. So we're going to be in chapter 23, verse 22. The words are going to be up on the screen, but I think it's really important that we understand this before we move into Ruth chapter 2. And here's what it says. When you harvest the crops in your land, do not harvest the grain along the edges of your field, and do not pick up whatever the harvesters drop. Leave it for the poor and the foreigners living among you. I am the Lord your God. This passage is, or this verse is in this passage talking about the festival of harvest. This festival of harvest, which is where God has his people make sure to provide for the needs of those poor and those who are foreigners in the land. This was the law. This was the law that Naomi and Elimelech were raised under. This is the law that the Jewish people understood as the way of life, what they should and should not be doing. This holiday was one that goes back all the way to the time of God's people leaving Egypt, the exodus of Egypt, when they needed to be provided for because they were in need. And he wanted to make sure that they didn't forget to be able to provide for those other people who were foreigners in the land. It's really interesting because even today in the Jewish tradition, Ruth, the book of Ruth, is one of the most studied passages for the Jewish people because of how it aligns with what we're getting ready to talk about. But the main purpose of this celebration was to express appreciation for the bounty and blessings that had been given to them, because they didn't always have it. At times, they were the ones that needed to be shown kindness, needed to be receiving the kindness. And so God wanted to make sure that they were the ones showing kindness when they were being blessed. Then there's an untold amount of good that comes from modest acts of charity. It's a good thing to give to those who are in need, to give to those foreigners, to give to the people who don't have what you might have or don't have what's there, or just be able to provide for them the basic needs of our life. Naomi and her husband, Elimelech, when they left the land, there was a famine in the land. And so they left and they went to Moab and they found a life and made a life. And now, if you followed through the first few messages, well, now we're tracking back with Naomi and now Ruth, who Naomi, her husband, Elimelech, had died. Ruth, her husband, has died. Naomi's kids have died. And now it's Naomi and Ruth back. They had heard that there was prosperity in the land that God had promised them. And enter on the scene, a hero's entrance, Boaz. We're starting in chapter 2 now. If you want to open your Bible to Ruth chapter 2, we're going to be talking about Ruth chapter 2 for a little bit today. But I wanted to focus in a little bit on this character named Boaz. Man, have anybody ever played apples to apples? Anybody? Yeah. There's a few of you. How my family plays apples to apples is there's red cards and there's green cards, right? And the red cards are the funny ones that everyone plays, and the green cards are a lot of these attributes that you kind of get to see. And at the end of the game, we read off the attributes that we have, and we see, that aligns. You know, it's a really fun way to play the game. And now let me tell you, Boaz had all of the green cards that were good in this game, right? He had all of it. Verse 1 in chapter 2 starts off and says this: Now there was a wealthy and influential man in Bethlehem named Boaz. Hero's entrance if I ever saw one, right? He comes onto the scene, he's wealthy, he's influential, but the cards just keep adding up for him. He doesn't just get wealthy and influential, right? He is a man of God, verse 4 tells us. And as we continue to start looking at a little bit more about the character of Boaz, we start discovering a lot of things. Not only was he a man of God, but he was a good employer. Again, he was wealthy, so he had people that worked for him. He had people that he was responsible to and that were responsible to him. And he was a good employer. In verse 5, whenever he shows up on the scene, he greets his people with an awesome greeting, and they return the favor and they greet him back. This was a man who understood how to treat people, how to treat especially the people that he worked for. They weren't responding out of a guilt or out of an obligation. They were responding because they genuinely cared about who he was and the influence that he had. He wasn't just a good employer, but he also took note. He was in good standing of those he was blessing. Now, if we go back to the Leviticus chapter, the Leviticus passage, this was the customs to be able to not harvest the edges of the field. And as they didn't harvest the edges of the field, a lot of times in those days, the foreigners were the same foreigners year in and year out, repeat customers, right? And Boaz not only took note of who was there, who was he blessing. These aren't people that he's paying. These are people that he's legitimately blessing. He takes note of Ruth, who is new to the field. He inquires about her, like, hey, well, who is this new person that's there? Ruth was begging to glean from the field. They show up back in Bethlehem, and they understand, hey, we need something, and we're widows, and we're the foreigner. I'm the foreigner, and I need to do something. And Naomi, who had most likely participated in this ritualistic law that has them not glean or not harvest the edges of the field, knew that this now, what she had been very generous with, was now something that she needed. This charity, this generosity that she had most likely, because her and her husband had wealth and had property, most likely that they had given of their own stuff to people in need, they were now the recipients of. He was kind. He was humble. He didn't see himself as better than anybody else. And what he would do at that point is he would, at the edges of the field, it was a blessing to the people from the overflow of what he couldn't even have, what he couldn't even harvest. He was following God's law when it would have been easy to justify not following God's law. He was following God's law when it would have been easy to not justify God's law. I've been a parent long enough to where I've had a few of these parentisms that come up. Anybody else have a few parentisms that come up? The ones that I used to make fun of my mom for and my dad for and be like, oh, that doesn't make any sense, right? I can remember one of them whenever I'd get a whole bunch of food on my plate and my eyes were bigger than my stomach and I'd put it all on there and then I just wouldn't finish it and she'd look at me and say, yeah, well, maybe your mom said something different. My mom said something like, there are starving kids in Africa, right? And in my mind, I was just sitting there like, well, they're more than welcome to come polish off the leftovers, right? Like, they're more than welcome to come do it. I don't care if they come over and polish this off, but it doesn't make any sense that I have to eat it because they're starving. Like, that doesn't make any sense. There was a famine in the land. That's why Naomi and Elimelech left. There was a famine in the land. And the famine in the land, as we've been following the story of Naomi and Ruth, the famine that was in the land was a severe famine. And it affected Boaz and the people that were in God's promised land just as much. When Ruth and Naomi returned to Bethlehem, they were coming on the heels of this famine that had just done unrepairable damage to the community. In those days, and even today, when there are severe famines in the land, it takes years to recover. It causes malnutrition, starvation, disease, high death rates, crime, and genuine distrust between neighbors. This is all of the stuff that had to have happened during this time of severe famine. And here we have Boaz in this moment who had lived through this famine and was now faced with an opportunity and a choice. It would have been really easy for him to forget about the law of God in that moment and say, listen, I need to be able to guard my resources because scarcity leads to resource guarding. I need to be able to provide for these families, my employees, the people that are dependent upon me for their paycheck, for their food, for the food on the table. Our barns have been empty. Imagine the strife that took place between neighbors when there's a scarcity of food. What would you do if you didn't have food to eat, if you didn't have food to feed your family? There was so much animosity that builds up whenever there's a scarcity of resources. And now God's blessed the land again, and the famine is over, and it's returning. And here we have one of the first harvests that's taken place, and Boaz doesn't neglect to give to God, doesn't neglect the law of God, even though it would have been really easy to justify not doing so. Walter Bergerman says, prosperity breeds amnesia. And as we are blessed, as we become blessed with things, it becomes easy to forget why God created the law, why God had the law to bless others, to take those edges. And it would have been easy to say, I'm just going to collect everything I can until my barns fill back up, until my barns are full again, and then I will be able to bless again. Then I'll be able to take on these people. But he didn't do that. You see, Boaz didn't worship his wealth, he worshiped with his wealth. The things that he had, the things that he saw, was a way to give God the glory that he deserved. It was a way to give God what he had earned. It's really hard to legislate morality. Do you know that? Like, it's really difficult to legislate morality. We just came back from camp, and I sat down and had all my preteen campers come in, and we had a meeting, and we went over the rules and some of the fun things that we could do. But one of the things I told them is I said, listen, there's no sneaking out. You can't be sneaking out of the cabin. And we found out that two of our boys went over and pranked the girls, and we sat down and we were like, what are you doing? We said, no sneaking out. They said, we didn't sneak out. We just walked out the front door. I thought they were going to the bathroom, but there was no sneaking involved in what they were doing, so they followed the letter of the law. Genius. How many times do we become so good at finding those loopholes around? And Boaz had that opportunity to be able to find the loopholes around, but he refused to. He started to go back to the purpose of the law was to bless others, to share that blessing. You see, the life of a gleaner was not an easy life. The life of someone who was gleaning those fields wasn't an easy life. Their life always hung in the balance. And most landowners were obligated to give to them what God had commanded, which is all that was on the edge. There was a responsibility to bless them with the blessings that they had received as a way to keep them humble and in tune with the generosity that God expected of them and wanted them to show people. So it would have been easy for him to do just what the law requires. But as we look at Boaz in this chapter, we need to see something very clearly, that Boaz represents Jesus in this book. Boaz represents Jesus in this book. And Boaz understood that the power of God's blessing wasn't found in legislating morality. The power of God's blessing was found in showing radical kindness towards others. The book of Ruth is fascinating because while there's all the drama, there's drama woven through each and every single verse of this book, there's no villain in the story. There's not a negative word spoke against anybody. No one does anything wrong that you can find. Yet Boaz is set apart as this foreshadowing of Jesus with this radical kindness and redeemer and protector that is required of him. We're going to pick up in verse 14 in Ruth chapter 2 as we see this radical kindness on display. And here's what it says. Verse 14 says this: at mealtime, Boaz called her, Ruth, to come over and help yourself to some food. Now, she'd been working all day. Remember, he showed up and he's like, who's this new person over here? He recognized that it was somebody that wasn't a repeat customer. It was somebody new. She'd been working hard all day. He had asked his foreman about her, like, who is that? He got the little lowdown brief story, 30-second life story of who Ruth was. So he called her over. And he says this: you can dip your bread in the sour wine. So she sat with her harvesters, and Boaz gave her some roasted grain to eat. She ate all she wanted and still had some left over. This foreign Moabite woman was invited to the table and enjoyed fellowship and the protection of Boaz. That could only be, that there was zero obligation of him to provide. When Ruth went back, in verse 15, when Ruth went back to work again, Boaz ordered his young men, let her gather grain right among the sheaves without stopping her. and pull out some of the heads of barley and from bundles and drop them on purpose for her. Let her pick them up and don't give her a hard time." So Ruth gathered barley there all day, and when she beat out the grain that evening, it filled an entire basket. She carried it back to town and showed her mother-in-law. Ruth also gave her the roasted grain that was left over from her meal. Ruth is relegated to a life of blessings along the edges, but Boaz didn't want to leave it there. Boaz went far beyond where he was required to serve, where he was required to give, and blessed her with far more than she could ever ask for. This idea of radical kindness in this encounter goes far beyond the ritualistic laws and demands that the law provides. He provides protection and blessing and belonging that she didn't deserve. When Ruth was picking up the blessings along the side of the field, it was that opportunity that he saw to show some radical kindness to somebody who did not deserve it. She was a foreigner in those days. That was a dangerous area because everyone knew societally that she was a foreigner. She was poor. She was a widow. And untold things ended up happening there. But you see, I think blessing is gleaned from obedience. Blessing is gleaned from obedience. If obedience is the field that you're planting, then blessing is what you're harvesting. And it's not a prosperity gospel idea to where, well, if I just do the right thing. But when we become obedient to the person that we're serving, the law, the letter of the law, becomes obsolete. The letter of the law, it's not just about doing the things that I have to do, doing the things that I'm obligated to. It's about reaching the potential that the law was given for. You see, Boaz could have easily been justified in blessing Ruth while she was on the edges of the field. He didn't have to bring her in, yet he does. He welcomes her into his field. He defends her from those who would do her harm. He offers her food and drink, and as they sit together and fellowship together, during his meal, he speaks kindly to her, and he praises her faithfulness to her mother-in-law. He tells his field hands to purposely drop more, to bless her even more. And it is at his command that throughout the barley and the harvest that she gleans even more. Hey, drop some of this along the side. I want her to leave here with an absolutely filled basket. He invites her back. It's not just a one and done deal. He says, hey, I don't want you to go to any other fields. I want you to continue coming into my field so I can continue to bless you. As a result, Ruth is uplifted, saved from humiliation, and Naomi and her are rescued from starvation. Her hope is restored. The blessing wasn't on the edge. The blessing wasn't the rations on the edge. It was the relationship. It was the relationship that offered hope to her that was the real blessing. This is the picture of what God is doing for us, who God is and his goodness. There's a painting, it's called The Gleaners. No, you got that. There's a painting, it's called The Gleaners. It's painted in 1875 by Jean. I practiced this so much and now I messed it up. Jean-Francois Millet. And as you look at this painting that was painted, it's a representation of what we find in Leviticus, where these women are along the edges of the field, far away from the harvest, far away from what's going on in the middle, and they're picking up this food along the side so they don't starve. These were the urban beggars of the day. And what they had to do is they had to receive a blessing from the landowner to be on the property. It was a blessing just to allow them off because the landowner had no obligation to even allow them on their land. So they would receive this blessing from the landowner and glean what they could so they didn't starve. Because bringing them into the main part of the field was risky. If you look closely at this, you can see kind of the haystacks and the amount of harvest that is being gathered behind them. And here are these ladies picking up the small scraps along the outside. These are the scraps that nobody was going to use anyways. These are the people that the landowner was blessing from a distance. He was blessing them, saying, yes, you can have that. It's my cup overflowing anyways. I'm not going to use it. He was blessing them from his abundance. He was blessing them from the edge. Notice how far away the gleaners are from what's actually happening. And what Boaz did is something very different than what's happening here. While he's noticed on the edge, he said, hey, I want you to come on in. It would have been really easy. He said, glean right along the sheaves, right along the harvest, right along the blessing that we're harvesting right now. It would have been really easy for an unscrupulous person to just start taking things that didn't belong to them, taking more than they could have ever hoped for. Yet he does it anyways. The landowner had every right for his blessings to stop at the edge of his influence. We were well within our legal rights. Boaz was well within his legal rights to bless others at a distance and to keep the blessings at the edges of his life. But what did I tell you? Boaz is a representation of who in this book? Jesus. Boaz is the representation of Jesus in this book. And before Jesus was even on the scene, he was this representation of radical kindness. And in Matthew chapter 5, when Jesus is here on earth, he says this, chapter 5, verse 15, or verse 17, he says this, don't misunderstand, I have not, why I have come. I haven't come to abolish the law, but I've come to fulfill it. I've come to fulfill the law. There was no reason for Boaz to respond so favorably to this Gentile Moabite woman who was an enemy of his people. It went against everything that he believed as revealed in the law, yet he had compassion and mercy on her and extended to her everything he could bless her with. To provide for her, not just by being on the edges of the blessing, but by offering her a future, a hope for the future. This is quite possibly the clearest picture that we see in the Old Testament of the Messiah's love for the Gentiles, for his church. Ephesians 2:12 says this, in those days, you were living apart from Christ, right? You were living apart from Christ. You were excluded from citizenship among the people of Israel, and you did not know the covenant promises God had made to them. You lived in this world without God and without hope. Oh, man. You ever been there? You ever been there living without hope? Oh, it's a dreadful place. It's a dreadful place where it seems like every single thing that you do, it's life-altering. They were kept along the edges. They were people who had no right to be there, but they were brought in close. They had no right to be brought in close. They had accepted their lot in life and were happy and willing to stay along the edges just to catch a glimpse of the blessings that God was sending. But then in verse 13, listen to this. This is the good stuff. This is the good stuff. Are you ready? Are you ready? This is the good stuff. In verse 13, but now you have been united with Christ Jesus. Once you were far away from God, but now you have been brought near to him through the blood of Christ. But now you've been brought, you were on the edges, happy to collect the blessings, the survival blessings, but what happened through Jesus is he brought you in. He just like Boaz, he brought you in for protection and love. He didn't have to, but he was the only one that could. Jesus did the same thing in John chapter 4. He shows up and he finds a woman on the edge. There's a woman at the well. Some of you know the story. He shows up and he sees this woman on the edge just trying to survive, just doing the bare minimum, and she was happy to receive a blessing. And what did God do? God brought her in close. God went up and talked to her. Jesus came up and he found her in her moment of need and he said, hey, what are you looking for? And she's like, I'm just looking for a sip of water. And she found the Savior of the world. She found way more than she could have ever hoped for because she was looking for what was right in front of her. She was looking for something to survive. God wanted to bless her with so much more. God wanted to bless her with hope. Jesus told her, he's like, anybody who's looking for this water, you're going to be thirsty again, but I've got the living water. I've got something that's going to bless you far beyond what you could ever ask, hope, or imagine. And then she goes and tells everybody. She leaves her life of sin and she goes and tells everybody about this blessing that's there. And as the church, we need to understand that this blessing is found in the hope of Jesus Christ, and it's our responsibility to demonstrate that for the world. I'm going to go ahead and ask Gio to come up, and he's going to play some in the back because we're going to go through communion today. But I had a God moment while I was at camp this week, where there was a kid, again, there's more than our church that goes. There's 100 and some kids from all over north central Ohio. And there was a kid in my cabin. He'd went through a rough time. He'd went through a really rough time. He's been in and out of foster care. He lost his parents to drugs. They've been in and out of prison. And I think, Taylor, I think they passed away, didn't they? And so he was actually living with his grandpa. And while he was 11 years old, he was sitting there watching TV with his grandpa, and his grandpa had a heart attack and died. He had to call the squad, watch them be taken away. Now he's again removed again from another house, and he's living with some cousins. And it was in these moments that as we sat there and we talked and we engaged, and I think there were 5 or 6 kids in our cabin that had death really near to them, to where they wanted some hope. And at the end of that camp, they didn't want to leave. They're like, man, I don't want to go home. And I asked one of them, I said, why? And we shared it in our staff meeting. And one of the kids at a camp said, I just hope God looks like you. I just hope God looks like you. Hopefully not physically. Hopefully not physically. Hopefully he's got more hair. But man, what a responsibility. For someone to come up to you and say, I hope God looks like you. As the church, we have a responsibility to have a radical kindness. Not just to those in our influence, not just to those who are already in, not just to those who are already with us, but to those on the edge who aren't even looking for it. Who are the people in your life that are on the edge of your influence in your life that you can begin showing a radical kindness to? Ruth wasn't looking for it. She was just looking to keep her head down and do something else. And she got blessed by the best. It's not just something that I call us to, because without Christ in this, it's all for nothing. But we were shown this exact same radical kindness when there was a debt that we couldn't pay back, that someone else took our place for. That someone else took that opportunity to show extreme radical love and kindness to us. And as this morning, we're here in this room, we're going to have an opportunity to partake in communion, which is that reminder of what God has done for us, the grace and mercy that he showed to us, that he didn't have to. He'd been well within his rights, well within the law, to not extend this grace and love towards us, yet he did it anyways. He didn't stop just because it's what the law said. He didn't want to just follow the letter of the law. He wanted to follow the heart of the law. And today, if you've accepted Christ into your life, you've experienced that radical roller coaster of a ride of joy that God has put upon your life. That God has put upon your heart, where things have been changed in a way that you can't explain, where hope has been given, where there was only despair, where you had accepted a lot in life. And we're going to have an opportunity today to partake in communion together. And so here's what I'm going to ask. In just a minute, I'm going to have you go ahead and stand, and you're going to go through, and you're going to pick up a piece of bread and a cup of juice and return to your seats and hold them for a moment. And during that time, I want you to pray, and I want you to have a moment with God. And whether you're sitting down or standing up, it doesn't matter. Gio's just going to be playing in the background, and I just want you to have a moment with God. Just wants you to have a moment where you're able to thank him for the things that he's done in your life. Those moments, those roller coaster highs of joy that you've experienced, how can we turn those into a locomotive that is unstoppable, that is an unstoppable force that is going to ram right through the people that are on the edge, bringing them into a relationship with us, offering them protection, offering them love, offering them hope when they feel like there is no hope left.